Hello, everybody. It's 2:30 right now. This is Sonia Hamill, and very pleased to welcome you to the ninth in a series of webinars on designing a regional cap-and-trade program. I know many of you have been with us for these and other calls, but for those who haven't, let me just welcome you on behalf of the World Resources Institute, the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, and the New America Foundation. We've been hosting this series of webinars specifically to focus on the topics that regulators and stakeholders need to think about as regional cap-and-trade programs are being designed. And this effort, this series of webinars, originally was designed to support the Western Climate Initiative, the work that's going on in the Western United States and Western Canada, as states and provinces are considering the development of a market-based program there. And since we began the design of this, it's also been extended to stakeholders and other interested parties across the country, in particular for the Midwest Governor's Initiative, and it's designed for anyone who's interested in the issues of designing a cap-and-trade program. Over the course of the series, this is the ninth in a series, I'm very pleased to say we now have over 450 people who are registered for listening to this series, and over 300 for this session today. The series is drawn heavily on experiences from existing and planned cap-and-trade programs in the United States and abroad, and you'll hear today that we're going to spend a lot of our time thinking about ways of potentially linking programs, connecting them across the U.S. and internationally. And we've got two experts here today who are two of the people that we think are foremost in the field of thinking about how we might connect programs and what issues are essential for connecting cap-and-trade programs. What are the basics that are needed for connection? What are some of the nicer features that would make the programs more seamless? And those are the kinds of issues we're going to talk about today from the point of view of U.S. cap-and-trade design and also international. I'm going to introduce both of our speakers just before they speak. I'm going to start with Derek Birkhoff, and Derek will go first, and then second we'll have Damien Meadows. Damien's from the European Commission, and I will introduce him, as I said, just before he starts. First, let me start with Derek Birkhoff. He's a senior member of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol team at the World Resources Institute. And what that means on a practical basis is that Derek manages WRI's work on the carbon offsets project, doing accounting, emissions trading, and carbon market policy development. He's actually the primary author of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for project accounting. And before he joined WRI, he worked for 10 years in the fields of energy and climate change consulting. He's got background in financial and economic and analytic tools and risk management. You're welcome to ask questions. Both Derek and Damien are going to take questions after they've spoken individually, and then again at the end we'll have an interactive discussion. As you look at your screen, you should see an area where you can type in your questions on the left-hand side of the screen, the part that is called Live Chat. And if you do that, we will then start taking those questions at relevant breaks during the presentations. So thank you all for coming, and let me turn it over to Derek.
Thanks, Sonia, and good afternoon or morning, as the case may be. My presentation is going to cover in a general sense how you get to an agreement on linking cap-and-trade systems for greenhouse gases. A general sense, because I'm not going to talk about specific systems here, but really what are the general considerations if you're looking at the design options or design elements of a cap-and-trade system, either developing your own system or trying to evaluate the elements of another cap-and-trade program. What do you need to focus on in the context of thinking about an agreement to link those systems? And a key point, in my opinion, anyway, is that when you're talking about linking cap and trade systems, it's primarily a matter of political will to link. And in the extreme circumstance, if you have two systems that are wildly different with totally different design structures, in principle, you could still link those systems as long as there was an agreement to set up a mechanism to track allowances and recognize allowances or credits from those systems. It might not work very well, but the technical requirements are fairly basic. In practical terms, the real barriers to linking really have to do with political considerations about the compatibility and consistency of the systems. So in this talk today, I'm going to go over what are the basic design elements in a cap and trade system where you really want to have some consistency and compatibility in order to get to a linking agreement. What are some of the design options where if you have them in one system and not in the other, they may preclude a linking agreement, so potential deal breakers. And finally, what are the design options for cap and trade systems where you can have some inconsistency and differences between programs, and they probably won't be that important to a linking agreement. So in shorthand, what's the good, the bad, and the ugly of getting to an agreement on linking cap and trade programs? Now, before we get started on the details of the different design elements and options, if you are designing a cap and trade program or you have a cap and trade system and you're contemplating a link to another system, first question is, what should guide your evaluation of another system? How should you think about a linking agreement? What essentially are the core principles for making an evaluation of a linking option? And at WRI, we think there are basically four core principles to a linking agreement. The first being environmental integrity, and that, more specifically, you want, if you have a cap and trade system, first and foremost, you want to limit the emissions within your system to the level of the cap. And if you're contemplating a linking agreement, you want the overall emissions in the two programs that are linking to not go above what they would be in a scenario where they're not linked. So you want your emissions to at least stay under or stay at the level of the cap set by the two programs, or be under that total cap and not go above it. So first and foremost, you don't want to violate the integrity of the cap that you're placing on emissions. Second, institutional compatibility. Generally speaking, if you're contemplating linking to another cap and trade system, you want the systems for tracking emissions, for enforcement and compliance to be generally similar and compatible, not just for the general functioning of your trading systems when they're linked together, but also as a matter of building mutual confidence and trust, and as a matter of transparency when you're contemplating a linking agreement. Third principle, economic efficiency. I think probably the primary rationale, certainly if you ask an economist, if you're looking at linking trading systems together, is economic efficiency. In other words, you'll be able to take advantage of opportunities for lower cost emission reductions. And the general idea here is that if you link two trading systems together, all things being equal, the total cost of compliance for meeting the cap, the overall cap set by both programs, is going to be lower in a situation where you link than in a situation where you don't link and those programs are operating independently. If that's not the case for some reason, or if you expect the total cost for some reason to be higher under a linking scenario, then you probably don't want to do it. So you want to take advantage of the efficiencies of trade through a linking agreement. Now, a corollary to that, of course, is while the total cost of compliance may be lower under a linking agreement, it's not necessarily going to be lower for all the participants. And if you're talking about linking a program with a very stringent cap to one that has a more lenient cap, all things being equal, you'll probably see the cost of compliance in the lenient system increase. And that could create some difficulties in terms of equity considerations. So the final core linking principle is that you want the burdens of compliance under the linked programs to generally be consistent and compatible. Of course, there are questions can arise with respect to how you define equity and what that means and what is an equitable agreement. That's all a matter for the political negotiations. But generally speaking, it's not going to be feasible to link where you have wide disparities in the economic burden in one system versus another as a result of the linking agreement. So getting into the details of what are the different design options and how do those play out in a linking agreement, I'm going to separate the different design options into three categories, reorganize things a little bit here and start with the bad. So I'll go over what some of the design options that are probably deal breakers in the context of linking trading systems if you have them in one system and not the other. I'll then talk about the general design elements of cap and trade systems where consistency probably matters in the context of a linking agreement. And then finally talk about the ugly part where inconsistency is probably okay and can be tolerated in a linking agreement. Now, these are general categories. There are no hard and fast rules here. Again, a lot of what this boils down to is political acceptability and political will, and the details really matter. So there may be elements in one category that really could be bumped to another depending on the circumstances and the situations, and I'll talk some more about that as we go through. In terms of the deal breakers, these would essentially be design elements that create what I would call an emissions loophole. And the basic rationale here is that first and foremost, the objective of a cap and trade system is to preserve emissions at the level of the cap. You don't want to go above that. And if you have design options that might violate that rule, and you have them in one program and not the other, that's going to create very significant difficulties in reaching a linking agreement. And the basic rule of thumb here is that if global emissions under a linking scenario would be higher than they would be if you did not link two systems, then that's going to create a barrier to linking that's going to violate the environmental integrity principle. Now, going through what some of these elements are, of course, the obvious one would be a price cap, safety valve, whereby if the price of allowances in one system rises to the level of the price cap, you essentially can simply pay the price of the cap for emissions that go above your compliance obligations, and overall emissions in your system can increase. The risk here, of course, is if you link if you have a system that has no price caps and you link to a system that does have a price cap, essentially that price cap will set the ceiling price for the entire linked system. And if the market price in that total linked system rises to the level of the price cap, emissions will rise above what they would have been. Global emissions will be higher than what they would have been without a linking agreement. So that's probably going to preclude linking, as long as environmental integrity is a core goal. Now, of course, if you have two systems with price caps, there may be room for negotiation there, and a lot depends on where the price cap is set. So if you have a ceiling price which is really high, it may not have practical significance if you don't expect market prices to rise to that level. So the details do matter. Looking at some other possible deal killers, if you're looking at borrowing provisions, in some cases that could be a deal breaker. Specifically, if you're talking about borrowing against undefined future commitment periods. So if you allow participants in your system to essentially borrow allowances from future commitment periods, and the targets have not been set for those commitment periods, the risk is that when it comes time to set those targets, the amount of borrowing would be a factor in a decision about where to set the target. You might set your cap higher than you otherwise would have without the borrowing, and that could undermine environmental integrity. If you had that in one system and not another, that could be a potential deal breaker. As far as I know, there are no systems that are contemplating that kind of arrangement, so it's more of a theoretical consideration, but it may come up in an evaluation of linking prospects. Ex-post adjustment provisions, these would be any kind of provision that allows the administrator of a cap-and-trade program to essentially issue more allowances at the end of a commitment period if it's deemed that prices are too high or economic burdens are too high on the participants, essentially printing more allowances and increasing the level of the cap on an ex-post basis. This is another kind of design option that might undermine the environmental integrity of a linked system. Again, if you have a system that doesn't allow those adjustments, that's going to cause some trepidation as far as linking to a system that does have those kind of provisions. Another consideration that comes up, linking an absolute cap system to one that caps based on emissions intensity. That is, you could have a system that caps not absolute emissions, but the emissions per dollar of GDP or a similar metric, so that emissions will decrease below, will go below what they otherwise would have been, but the absolute level of emissions can continue to rise. That is also cited in some cases as a potential deal breaker. Folks who have an absolute cap and trade system may hesitate about linking to a system with an intensity-based cap. The thing to keep in mind here, though, is that the linking itself will not lead to greater overall emissions. So if you're looking at the general criterion, are emissions higher under a linking agreement than they would have been without linking? If you link to an intensity-based system, that's not going to be true. The system with an intensity-based cap may have higher absolute emissions. The absolute emissions won't be fixed, but the linking of another system to that system won't exacerbate that increase in emissions. It won't add to it. So I put a line through that option just because it won't necessarily violate this overall principle of environmental integrity. Nevertheless, it comes up as a consideration, and particularly if you're looking at equity concerns and the relative burden on industry. Linking to if you have an absolute system and you're looking at linking to an intensity-based system, that could still be a strong consideration. Finally, the last issue here is leakage. This isn't really a design element so much, but it can be a concern if you're looking at a possible linking agreement. If you have a system where leakage is a potential significant risk, that is, you're looking at capping the emissions from one set of sources, but there's a significant risk that those emissions will simply be displaced to other sources outside of the cap. That can undermine the environmental effectiveness of your system, and there's a possibility that if another cap-and-trade system links to yours, that it could exacerbate that kind of effect and drive an increase in leakage, and you would have an overall increase in global emissions. That's, again, it can be difficult to quantify and evaluate, but where that is a particular risk, that can create some barriers to a linking agreement. So moving on from the potential deal breakers to the areas where you probably want to have some consistency and compatibility, but having some differences isn't necessarily going to scuttle a deal on linking your systems. These are generally design options where that have to do with comparable levels of stringency and comparable mechanisms for compliance. So stringency of emissions caps, this is going to be a primary concern, I think. Politically, it's not likely that you're going to get a linking agreement where, structurally you're going to create an incentive for massive transfers of allowances from one system to the other and transfers of wealth going the other direction. So realistically, you want cap-and-trade systems that have similarly stringent caps so that they're imposing a similar burden on covered sources with respect to what the business's usual emissions would have been. Beyond that, though, the stringency can be a challenge in some cases to try to evaluate. Of course, the simplest way to evaluate the stringency of different systems is to look at price levels. But depending on how the systems are designed, price isn't always the final answer. A lot depends on how caps may decline over time relative to the other system, whether banking and borrowing is allowed, and things of that nature. So to comprehensively evaluate stringency, you'd really want to look at which industries are covered, which gases are covered, and what are the business's usual projections. And there may be some subjectivity involved in that. Furthermore, it's you're fundamentally looking at questions of equity here, I think. And there may be circumstances where it makes sense to link to a much more lenient system. For example, hypothetically, if you were looking at a cap-and-trade program in a developing country, for example, you might decide that the equitable arrangement would be to have a system with more lenient caps in a developing country. So there are a range of considerations in looking at this question of stringency and comparability. Next item on the list, governments and enforcement systems. I think a fundamental criterion if you're looking at linking to another cap-and-trade program is whether the target system has effective governance and enforcement systems. You do not want to link to a system that is not able to effectively track emissions or to prosecute non-compliers or is unable to enforce the cap, essentially. If you have a system like that, that could rise to the level of a deal breaker in terms of whether you link or not. But beyond that, you want generally comparable governance and enforcement systems. They don't have to be identical. But in order to establish mutual confidence for a linking agreement, you want to have some compatibility there. Monitoring and verification standards and data quality. I think the key issue here is the quality of data that is generated under both systems. The monitoring and verification, the procedures and the instruments used to track emissions or measure emissions, for example, do not have to be identical. I think if you had emissions monitors in one system and you track fuel usage in another, that's not necessarily an issue as long as the data that you get out at the end of the day is comparable in quality and has comparable levels of certainty. But that's certainly something you'd want to evaluate if you're contemplating a linking agreement, that the data you get under both systems is of comparable quality and is consistent. Similarly, compliance penalties and procedures. The simplest kind of compliance penalty is simply to force participants to pay a fine if their emissions go above the number of allowances that they are able to surrender. But there are other ways to enforce compliance, such as taking away from allocations in future commitment periods, or other things like denying companies access to government contracts and things of that nature. So you can have some differences between systems in what the compliance penalties are, and the procedures, and the timelines for enforcing compliance. These compliance penalties and procedures don't have to be identical, but they, for the linked system to work well, you probably want them to be similar. And certainly, if you're looking at monetary compliance penalties, you'd want those to be more or less consistent and similar between the two programs. Otherwise, you run into the same kinds of questions you'd get with price caps and safety valves and things like that. Banking and borrowing provisions. The thing to keep in mind here is that if you have one system that allows banking, essentially you're going to have banking across the entire linked system. So it's certainly not a technical requirement that both systems allow banking and borrowing under the same terms, but it's going to help in terms of getting linking agreements. But if one system is set on not allowing banking or not allowing borrowing, that could create a roadblock to a linking agreement, since through the link you're essentially going to allow those kinds of transactions across the entire system. Next, offset rules and policies. This could probably be the subject of a completely separate presentation here. I think there are three sets of things that you want to look at in terms of the consistency of carbon offset programs. First would, of course, be, are the rules for quantifying emission reductions from offsets and determining the additionality of offsets generally consistent and compatible. If you're concerned about environmental integrity, you're probably going to have hesitations about linking to a system that has much more lenient rules for additionality, or is less conservative in terms of estimating baseline emissions and quantifying reductions, or has lax monitoring and verification procedures and things like that. The second set of considerations, I think, has to do with eligibility rules for offsets. There are some programs that may allow certain types of projects that are not allowed under other programs. If you look at the EU, for example, they recognize offsets from the clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, but they do not allow credits from forestry projects, essentially, because of concerns about the quantification and some of the risks associated with those projects. It's those kinds of things that I don't know if they constitute a real deal breaker in a linking agreement, but it certainly could present some obstacles if there are certain types of offset projects recognized by one program, but that are under suspicion in the other program. And finally, when you're looking at offsets, some systems will place restrictions on the use of offsets for compliance. So there may be limits, saying that you can only meet a certain percentage of your obligation using offsets, and if those are different between programs, that could create some difficulties. In particular, if you have a program where you feel you don't want to encourage unlimited use of offsets, and you're linking to a program that does allow unlimited use of offsets, essentially the bar is going to be set by the system that allows full use of offsets, and that would be certainly a consideration in any kind of linking agreement. Again, maybe not to the level of a deal breaker. It depends on the importance of those policy goals and other considerations. But these are all areas where you probably want to have some generally consistent criteria and design rules. And finally, registry systems. Ultimately, you want you have to have the technical compatibility, the ability of your registry systems to talk to one another and communicate the transfer of allowances and credits. It's not an absolute requirement that the registry systems be identical, or even that you have to merge them somehow, but for the sake of transparency and building confidence, the systems should be generally compatible, and at the very least have to be able to communicate with each other. So moving on from the requirements where you really probably need some compatibility and consistency to some other design elements of cap and trade systems. These are areas where some differences in the design probably don't matter as much to a linking agreement. There are no absolutes here, but generally provisions related to the coverage and distribution of emissions obligations can be different between systems and not materially affect the functioning of the systems or matter very much in terms of the core principles that I described earlier. So provisions related to sectoral coverage, which sectors are included or not included in cap-and-trade programs, won't necessarily be a material concern or affect environmental integrity or the efficiency of the system. Allocation methods, again, not as significant a concern. In principle, it doesn't matter if you have a load-based or a source-based approach to capping the emissions in the power sector. So where you place the obligation on meeting emissions limits. In practice, there may be some issues that arise there, in particular with the data quality and being able to quantify with the same degree of accuracy the emissions in a load-based system versus a source-based system. So there may be some issues that arise in that context. Do you have comparable data quality and tracking systems? But those issues aside, it doesn't really matter whether you have a load-based or source-based system in terms of the cap on emissions. Similarly, commitment periods or compliance periods. If you have one system that requires annual true-up and another that's every 3 or 5 years or something like that, there may be some issues that arise in that context, but it shouldn't be a deal breaker in terms of how the system functions. One area where it could be a problem is if you're talking about undefined targets for commitment periods. Going forward, if you have one program that's if you have inconsistent commitment periods and you're setting targets for future commitment periods, there's a possibility for gaming or trying to set a target that brings an advantage to your system if you're not sort of going through that target setting process all at the same time. But in most of the systems I think that we're talking about today, we're looking at long-term targets that have already been set pretty much. Finally, new entrants and closure provisions and rules for opting in or opting out of a program. Again, these are more distributional and coverage concerns that don't really affect the environmental integrity or the economic efficiency of a linking agreement, so they're probably not going to be major barriers. There could be some issues that come up in terms of the relative economic burdens on different sectors within different countries, and that sort of the overall questions about equity and distribution could come to the fore in some linking agreements. But in terms of how well the system is going to function if you link, and the direct environmental integrity and efficiency concerns, these kinds of provisions probably don't matter as much. So finally, wrapping up, just some key takeaway messages. Number one, the details really do matter. As I described earlier, some of the things that are potential deal breakers may not be that serious depending on the details of the design option. If you have a price cap that's set really high, that may not be a serious obstacle to a linking agreement. Alternatively, some of the coverage and distributional issues may be real issues in the context of a linking agreement. It depends on the circumstances. And there may be some areas where, you want general consistency, but if you have really widely disparate systems for governance and enforcement, for example, that could rise to the level of a deal breaker. Bottom line, political acceptability is what's going to drive an agreement on linking trading systems. The real issue is getting to a level of mutual confidence across a range of technical design elements, and being confident that the stringency and the enforcement mechanisms in the two systems are generally compatible. For most elements, though, close enough is probably good enough. You don't have to have identically designed systems for an effective linking agreement, as long as you have generally comparable enforcement systems in place and generally agreed upon targets for emissions, and there are no serious risks of violating environmental integrity or of widely disparate outcomes in terms of equity and the economic burden on participants. So that's it, and I'm open to taking questions.
Okay, and let me just remind people, thank you very much, Derek. Let me just remind people that questions can be submitted in the live chat box that's on the upper left-hand corner of your screen. And actually, Derek, I'm going to ask you to advance your last slide. And so there's one slide that didn't get shown, just so that people can see it. And right now there are no questions in the queue. So what I'm going to do is actually to hold all questions then. Please go ahead and submit them if you'd like to. But what I'm going to do is now go ahead and ask I'm going to introduce Damien and have him do his presentation, and then we'll take comparative questions at the end for both of you. We're very fortunate today, in addition to the good work that Derek's done in thinking about linking systems, we're very fortunate to have Damien Meadows join us today. It's actually late at night for him. He's calling in from Brussels, and has very kindly agreed to do this call, even though what time is it, Damien, at home?
About 9:15.
There you go. So that's dedication. That's dedication for you. Damien is the deputy head of the European Commission's unit that's responsible for the EU emissions trading system, often called the EU ETS. He has been at the Commission working on drafting and negotiating and implementing the EU's emissions trading directive, and has worked on the EU's ratification of the Kyoto Protocol and other climate-related legislation that's gone on within the Commission. In addition, Damien's been involved in negotiating the REACH law, that is a law that's not about climate change, but comprehensively reforms the EU chemical regulation. So he's very familiar with regulatory linking of programs across many countries. He holds a law degree in European law, and has worked in the environmental field since 1996. And before joining the Commission, he was a legal advisor at DEFRA. DEFRA is kind of the equivalent, the UK's government's Department of Environment, Transport, and the Regions, which is like EPA plus DOT together, plus some other good things. And he has been working with the UN Climate Change Secretariat in the negotiation of the Kyoto Protocol. So we're very lucky to have Damien here. He's going to give us the framework, the legal framework within the EU, and also explain exactly what it means as we look at the legal linking language. So, Damien, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sonia, and good evening, everyone. Well, I'll be sharing the EU's experience of emissions trading so far, and I guess I'll try and speak in just about 15 minutes or so, because I can see some interesting questions coming up. And I think it's good to address particularly what you're looking for tonight. We have learned a lot in the time since we proposed the EU's trading system in 2001, which has been running in 25 countries since 2005. And we have always seen emissions trading as a way of addressing global climate change. So this is part of a larger picture. From the very outset, we've been wanting to link systems. If I go to my first slide, my presentation is really in two parts. Part of it is what we've been saying for quite a while now in terms of who we can link to and what the conditions would be. The second part relates to the legislative proposals that the European Commission had put forward less than a month ago in January on how our system should look like to 2020 and beyond. And in some respects...
Damien, hold on one quick second, just a little technical thing. Laura, I'm going to ask you to advance the slides as my system is not allowing me to do it.
Okay, sure. So the second part of my slides will be talking about, in some areas, we're doing quite radical changes, but this is to make emissions trading more successful in Europe and to promote a global carbon market. So there's some new elements. On my first slide, this is the situation in the European system at present. We can link our system with any other country which has ratified the Kyoto Protocol and have joined up trading systems. However, that would not allow linking to a US system, whether at federal level without ratification or to WCI or RGGI or California or whatever. If I move forward a slide, already in 2004, we started considering whether this approach of Kyoto or bust was the right approach to take. And the European Parliament wanted us to examine whether our system could be linked up to regional trading systems that are emerging. And at the bottom of this slide, obviously, the candidates at that time are listed. This is something we've been looking into. I'll come to it in a later slide. The next one explains where we are right now. I saw a question asking whether we, for examples of actual linking. The European system last October, November, it was agreed how this would link up with the countries Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. That agreement came into force, I think, on the 31st of December last year. So our system, which was 27 countries, has now been expanded to those three European peripheral countries. As I said, we can link up to other parties to the Kyoto Protocol at present. But now I come to the new element, which is that after a year-long review process, we've considered it is appropriate to enable our system to link up with any mandatory emissions trading system which caps absolute emissions. And this can be in the US without Kyoto ratification, or it could explicitly be a program like RGGI or WCI. And the legal proposal we've put forward, therefore, has a range of systems for actually doing this in practice. Treaty arrangements, if it's with a country, agreements, possibly with the US states. But at the very least, I think what we could have is a system much like the RGGI system between the different states in New England, of reciprocal commitments which we apply domestically, but without a treaty or similar instrument being enforced. So in this legislation, which is expected to be agreed at latest by spring 2009, Europe's making clear that it is willing and able to link up with any other credible trading system in the world. And I'll say more on why in a slide or two. Now, I'll go through this, I think, very quickly because Derek's covered this very well. The currency used, I think my later slides will clarify this. A general word is that I think our experience in Europe, and we have made mistakes and we have corrected mistakes. For those of you who have seen our example, there was, in some member states in Europe, over-allocation in the first period. This led to a collapse in the carbon price, a carbon value of around 4 US cents per tonne. And so we've made mistakes. We've corrected them in the system. In 2008 onwards, our carbon price is at a more robust level of around 20 euros per tonne. But generally, I think the sound design considerations that you would have for your own system would make it something that can be linked up. And this is particularly in three elements: having a mandatory system, because a mandatory system is, in our view, the only way to get the real reductions at levels needed to tackle climate change. Voluntary systems can help kickstart things, but if you want a clear long-term carbon price signal, then through emissions trading, that would have to be a mandatory system. And in terms of absolute target setting, rather than having efficiency standards, I think in terms of simplicity, this is vitally necessary. When you do try to calculate per industry how you could calculate allocations based on intensity, then you can get yourself into an extremely long bureaucratic process without an outcome, which could then be revisited afterwards. I think absolute targets are the workable way ahead, and so we would be looking at linking to absolute target systems which are mandatory. Monitoring and reporting, important. Sanctions, obviously important for non-compliance. On safety valves, I agree 100% with Derek. If there is a safety valve, then this is a deal breaker for linking. I guess to give an example, if Europe had a safety valve, a price you paid to government to exonerate yourself from your commitment, which was 10 cents below a US safety valve, then it would be a great revenue earner for Europe, but no reductions would be taking place. And that kind of fiscal transfer, I imagine, would be unattractive in the American context. Likewise in Europe. So if there is a safety valve, then we move very much away from the idea of linking emissions trading system and into some form of fiscal or tax coordination, in my view. So that would be a deal breaker. But I'll say more on that when I talk about the clean development mechanism. Banking and borrowing. Well, the European system had limitations on banking to begin with between the first phase and the second phase. And given our experience where there was over-allocation, this was vitally necessary. However, from 2008 onwards, banking is guaranteed indefinitely. We think this is a sound design feature. And we do have an element of borrowing, so albeit against defined future targets, companies can borrow from the next year from their allocations. So we have elements of these. Finally, a robust registry system is a prerequisite here. We think, though, with good cooperation, then this should always be possible to have our registries speaking together. To move to my next slide. If any of you out there are thinking of covering aviation, international aviation, in Europe, certainly it's been a very fast growth sector, something like 90% increase in emissions since 1990, then we could have some tips on how to do this and also how to avoid double regulation. Because if any flights are covered by a system covering flights out of Chicago, say, then we would want to exclude them from the European trading system to make sure there isn't double regulation. Now, coming to the heart of the new elements on the EU trading system, we have a long-term objective, which is that, and Sonia might help me here, not to have global warming increasing temperatures above more than 2 degrees centigrade. I think that's 4.7 degrees Fahrenheit.
Something like that, yep.
Above pre-industrial levels. Based on the scientific evidence, we consider that we're risking catastrophic consequences if it goes above. And the best way to do this is through an international agreement with all countries on how we all contribute to these emission reductions, rich industrialized countries and the large developing countries. And in that context, emissions trading gives essential incentives, I think, for having such an international agreement. And that's the element I'd really like to highlight tonight, which I think is new, the issue of CDM and how in our systems, when we involve CDM, which we can do for very good reasons, how this can also have an important effect internationally. I'll just skip to the next slide. So, first of all, a key few elements which we're doing in our revision of the ETS. And this is also done in line with the things Derek said, in order to make our system more attractive to others. A a key element is that we'll be agreeing our levels of caps up front between the 27 countries in Europe, rather than having a process whereby each member state proposed its own, and then the European Commission actually had to reject around 23 of them for being too high. On reflection, we think there's better ways, and that's to agree this through a legislative process together. What we're doing now, though, is setting out clarity on the stringency of our system to 2020 and beyond. We're following the model that you see in proposals like McCain-Lieberman to have a trendline approach that leads, in principle, up to 2050 or so, giving industry very long-term certainty on where we're going. Although, obviously, with a review along the way, we're proposing 2025. And we're also saying that if there is an international agreement to address climate change, then we'll do more, because Europe thinks more has to be done than it's willing to do without an international agreement. So we've proposed a level of allocation if Europe is doing an independent commitment to reduce emissions. But we're saying that if the US, if Japan and others join up with us to do more, then our emissions trading system will deliver a bigger reduction. That's an important incentive for other countries to join us. And so there's just a picture of our cap in the future and how we would expect it to decrease in a predictable manner. The total size of the EU ETS is around 2 billion tons in the current trading phase. The allocation principles, I think I'll jump over these. If anybody has questions, then certainly come in. But we propose generally using much more auctioning from 2013 onwards, and in fact having 100% auctioning in the power sector, as we're seeing in some of the RGGI states. Now here's a real element I wanted to highlight, because linking is not just linking up trading systems, but, and I saw a question on this about CDM, would CDM avoid the need for direct linkages? You can link up trading systems through the mechanisms joint implementation, which is largely Russia, Ukraine, and the EU's new member states, and the clean development mechanism for around 130 developing countries. And the EU system is linked up with these. And this is important because just like those who are proposing safety valves and price caps, Europe is, of course, also concerned about excessive prices and stability in the market. Now, one manner of getting that is through having access to clean development mechanism reductions. This helps buffer prices. It helps provide an extra source of credits of reductions globally. So there's advantages for our systems in accepting this. There's also advantages in terms of addressing climate change because it's an incentive to get developing countries to do more. It's already involving them in significant emission reductions. So Europe's very open to a proportion of credits coming from the clean development mechanism. Not unlimited, but a proportion. It's a question of striking the balance. And this is where, and this is, I think, the very new element today, Kyoto basically set what was appropriate for all countries to do up until 2012. And going beyond 2012, then I think many in the US and the EU have a common view that countries should be doing more. Not all countries. Some of the least developed countries have their work cut out adapting to climate change. But that generally we expect many countries to do more. And therefore, it's important to consider how much CDM we want to buy and of what types. There's incentives for our systems to be using this, as I said, to moderate prices, to lead to global reductions, to address a global problem. I won't go into the details of my slides because I'm conscious that time's running and there's questions coming in. But to be brief, we foresee that even without an international agreement, and we do want an international agreement to follow Kyoto, but even without it, we would allow for the use of CDM credits and joint implementation in the EU trading system, and the conditions are set out in the slides. And once we do have this international agreement, then there would be significant additional access for CDM credits. And this, I guess, is the point I'd like everyone to pick up on today. I mean, beyond 2012, it's primarily in the context of having an international agreement that CDM is a very useful mechanism in terms of bringing about global reductions and being done in accordance with what each country should contribute. So we foresee some CDM access into our trading system come what may, but a greater level of inclusion once we have the international agreement that we're looking for. Just to run through the conclusions then briefly. Emissions trading is an instrument to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at least cost. I think there was a question there about taxation, and taxation is another way of doing this. But in our view, emissions trading is more amenable to setting up a global system, to having a global carbon market to address a global problem. I think it's difficult to link a taxation policy and an emissions trading system. So linked up emissions trading systems, we think, are the best way to address climate change. Politically, this gives us the assurance we're undertaking equivalent efforts. Environmentally, it will allow us, by reducing at least cost, to allow us to do bigger reductions for the same price. Now, the EU has learnt the hard way by going first. We saw with two of our member states, UK and Denmark, that they were setting up incompatible trading systems. And so the European Commission took the initiative of proposing a system which would ensure that everything was compatible across the European continent. We've already had the first experience linking this to Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein quite successfully. And we have now, in the last month or so, set out a much longer-term perspective in terms of how we expect companies to be contributing to addressing climate change. And a key part of this proposal is enabling us to link our system up to any other mandatory system capping absolute emissions in the world. This is the first occasion I'm aware of when we've talked directly to people in regional trading systems about these issues, but we're expecting by spring 2009 that this will be passed into law, and therefore we will be able to enter into direct negotiations to link up our trading systems. I was in discussions with the 27 member states this morning, and I would say there's pretty universal support for the ability to link up in this way. So I'm very glad that the New America Foundation has organized tonight's webinar, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Damien, thank you so much. That was great and comprehensive and very interesting. And I'm going to now pose questions that have been asked. You've touched on some of them. I'm going to bring some of them back, actually, for Derek also to be able to comment on if he'd like to. I'm taking questions as they have come up. Spencer Reeder asks from Washington, I'd like to hear both speakers describe what they envision the actual decision-making process might be that would be involved on the EU side in terms of making a linking agreement, sort of who decides what on their end and how is the decision arrived at. And I think, Damien, you've touched on it, but maybe you could just put it out there again as a summary for our listeners.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah, I mean, we've had our first agreement with Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. In terms of agreeing from the EU side, at present, as I said, we can link up to other states' trading systems if they've ratified Kyoto. If the law is passed, if the revision is passed as I expect, then we'd be able to link up to many other systems. And the manner in which this is done is that the European Commission, on behalf of the EU, would negotiate with the third country or regional system. And our member states then would ratify that. There would be a committee of member states looking at how the negotiations are done. But then the European community as a whole would ratify that linking agreement. So it would be one ratification, not 28 ratifications as we did for the Kyoto Protocol. If we had a treaty, that is. So we're only at the stage of talking with Japan, with New Zealand, with Australia, with others, with Switzerland, about linking our systems. We've not yet got into the formal negotiating legal text stage. But we're ready and willing to do this. It's more been an absence of emissions trading systems up and running which has held us back. That's the general way. The other element I mentioned, the reciprocal commitment, would be similar, but I think it would be done more at the technical level. Europe's willing to offer its registry systems for others to use to make sure that we have compatible electronic registries, because they must be able to speak together. If we get that wrong, it would be most unfortunate. And this reciprocal commitment would be done not through a treaty, but basically through your system saying to our system that an action's been undertaken in the Midwest, say, to cancel an allowance, and then we would create a corresponding one in the European system. So that would be a much more technical way of linking, but the process would be the same from the European side, that the European Commission, supported by member states, would negotiate this and agree the terms.
Great, very clear. There was a question that asked, I think you've already answered it sort of inherently, but let me ask anyway. Can the designs that have been put out by RGGI so far be linked with the EU ETS in advance of some kind of a national U.S. system?
Yeah, I don't know if Derek wants to say anything on that first, or... I think the design of RGGI is very sound. The levels of allocation we will have to see. Stringency is an important political issue, and Europe's had its own difficult experience here with stringency at the beginning. But RGGI's design seems sound in order to link up with the EU ETS. I would really highlight something Derek said about offsets and about how when you link, we place, I think, greater importance, or rather, it's a greater issue when you link what offsets you recognize externally from outside rather than what offsets you do internally. I'm pretty comfortable personally with everything RGGI plans internally in terms of offsets, because any system developed tends to do so responsibly, acting for its stakeholders and for the electorate. It's more questions of what credits they allow in from abroad, that obviously if you accept it in one system, it affects the other system. And so we would want to look more closely at that. But basically, I think the RGGI structure is a sound one.
Okay, Derek, any comments on that?
I would second that. I don't think, if you're looking at deal killers, I don't think there's anything in RGGI design that would be a deal breaker for a linking agreement. And probably the key areas that would be come in for some attention would be the overall stringency of the cap and the offset provisions possibly. But in terms of RGGI structure with the offsets and kind of tiered mechanism, pricing mechanism for letting in offsets, I don't think that would be a problem. RGGI will recognize CDM credits internationally, and as Damien mentioned, I think probably the internal or domestic offset system doesn't seem like it should be a problem.
There are several questions in the same general area, and again, you've touched on them a little bit, but maybe you could elaborate. Several people have asked variations of the question on how much do you think that the future CDM development will be set back by the proposed lower levels of credit use for compliance within the EU in Phase 3?
Yeah, I'm surprised by that question in a sense, because I think the perception of what we're proposing is different to the reality. I spent a few hours talking to people in the carbon market today, and I got the same impression to start with. But I think here, the EU can only propose legislation applicable to the EU. We want an international agreement covering all countries, but we can't do that by ourselves. So what we've done for the first time is given a clear and certain framework for CDM beyond 2012, something that was entirely lacking before January. And in that sense, I think we're supporting the CDM pretty strongly. And under an international agreement, then we have very large access to CDM, certainly larger than I've seen in some of the US proposals and in REGGI. So I think in the context of an international agreement, then we're being very supportive of CDM. But this is CDM is generated globally, and the EU is one actor. I mean, for CDM to be used to its full potential, I think we would need other significant trading systems there, a Japanese one, a US one. And we're saying even without this international agreement that we want, we will still accept CDM. And I think, well, people are still studying our proposals because, in my view, people have overlooked, I mean, I haven't mentioned it in my slides, but people have overlooked the fact that for Europe's greenhouse gas targets, just like now, Spain, Netherlands, Denmark, Finland are major purchasers of CDM to comply with their national targets. Under our proposals in January, there's access for around 700 million tons of CDM for national targets, in addition to the ETS, even without an international agreement. So I would urge here that nobody have the perception that the EU is somehow being negative on CDM. We think it's important, but basically, I just wanted to make the distinction that with an international agreement, obviously more can be done than without one. Europe's committing to reduce its emissions by 30% below 1990 levels if we have the international agreement, but only by 20% if we don't. So obviously the future's better for CDM if we have that international agreement. But I think our proposal is positive for CDM.
Okay, thank you. And someone else asks, does the growth of the CDM market essentially obviate the need for direct linkages? Can you use that as the transaction instead? And I wonder, again, if you wanted to just...
Yeah, I mean, it can work between systems as a way of leveling prices. But I think we do want, politically, economically, and environmentally, we want to have linked systems because in an optimal world, we want to have common policy actions to address climate change. Linking through CDM is a second best.
Yeah, I would second that. I mean, I think you can look at CDM as a kind of common currency for offsets potentially, but it's simply having different systems commonly recognizing this currency for offsets doesn't get you the same kinds of economies that you would get through actual direct linking of cap and trade systems.
Okay, and there's a question. I think I'm going to take this, unless there are other questions that come in now, I will take this as the last question. Someone asks whether program stringency, sort of comparatively between linked systems, would be, what are some ways that you might determine that, or create an assessment of program stringency for the purpose of considering linking? And that is, would you determine it by percentage of business as usual forecast, or different rates of population growth, or economic development? How would you decide that things were sort of good enough, as you said, Derek?
Yeah, I think, I mean, clearly that kind of assessment is going to be as much of an art as it is a science. I mean, yes, in principle, you want to look at where targets are set relative to BAU emissions. Of course, the challenge there is how do you accurately and I guess fairly project what business as usual would be. If you have two trading systems that are up and running, of course, one way to compare stringency is to look at what are the relative price levels in those systems, and that's probably as good as any indicator of what the relative stringencies are. But going forward, I think you have to kind of make your best judgment about what are the relative burdens and what should the right sharing of burdens be between the different systems that you're looking at.
And Derek, do you want, sorry, Damien, do you want to...
No, from our side, we're having this discussion with the European countries right now because in terms of the targets we've proposed, all the questions about population growth by 2020, about business as usual, about modeling are coming up, and we're in fact having a full-day discussion with over 100 member state experts tomorrow to discuss these. So they're important issues, but ultimately you come to the politically appropriate outcome in terms of deciding how to measure that stringency.
Okay, there's somebody's very concerned and definitely wants to hear a question about what the story is with Hungary.
Yeah, can I answer that? And the one from Carb, I see, on forestry.
Carb came in, yep.
Hungary is not considering opting out of the EU ETS. There is some litigation between states and the European Commission on carbon caps, and Hungary is one of those countries, but Hungary is implementing the EU trading system. On the question on forestry, now I was...
Let me read that one because others who haven't asked haven't seen this.
Okay.
The question posed by someone in CARB says, given the EU ETS's continued reluctance to accept forestry CDM offsets, I'm a little bit surprised to hear that RGGI's inclusion of at least in-region forestry offsets is not more of a concern for the EU potential ability to link to RGGI. So they were looking for some insight into that.
Okay. Now, this is where I believe that RGGI still had a consideration of whether to accept particular offsets from the CDM. If RGGI were to accept forestry CDM credits, so-called TSERs or LSERs, temporary CERs or long-term CERs, then we would be very concerned. We've had many people in Europe, we've had interest groups advocate for these, but they do not work in a company-based trading system. Our impact assessment explains why. But in 2003, we excluded these credits, and the European Parliament and member states supported that. And once again, after 4 years' reflection, we've excluded them again, because TCERs and LCERs are not, in our view, the way forward. And this is... deforestation and forestry is an enormously important area, and it's really important to address this source of emissions. It's critically important. But you don't address them through TSERs, LSERs. I think they would damage RGGI if they were usable within it. So what I said before was based on the view that RGGI wouldn't actually be accepting TSERs or LSERs internationally. Now, in terms of what RGGI does internally in terms of forestry, that's where what I've seen in terms of long-term covenants seems pretty robust. And I think you can have more confidence in terms of how a system is addressing these things internally. We know that for the US as a whole, this is an important question. We know for Australia, for New Zealand, this is an important question. And within Europe, we want to address these issues both within European agriculture and globally in forestry. In fact, we've proposed, and our member states have supported, using auction revenues to address deforestation. In December last year, there was unanimous agreement by our member states on doing that. So we are proposing ways to address forestry issues, but those ways are not TSERs or LSERs.
Okay, well, that's helpful, and I hope that was, if the CARB questioner has another follow-up question, please go ahead and ask it. I'm going to take one more, not seeing any others. There's a question which basically just says, how do you can a cap-and-trade emissions trading system harmonize with a cap and offsets and trade emissions trading system? That is, does the inclusion of offsets create any problems that disallow linking?
Well, in principle, I would say no. I think you'd probably have to look at the set of questions that I outlined earlier about what's the level of stringency with respect to the quantification, verification, additionality determinations, what types of offsets are involved, and are there any quantitative restrictions? Now, I think essentially the question boils down to if you have a cap-and-trade system that does not include offsets, what were the original policy rationales for excluding offsets, and if the system, if the designers of a system have essentially decided they don't believe offsets can provide credible real reductions, then that could be a barrier to link to a system that does have offsets. So I think ultimately it boils down to what are the reasons for including or not including offsets, and to the extent they're included, how confident are you in the rules and restrictions?
And Damien, anything else that you'd like to add on that?
No, I think the systems can be linked. I mean, for me, a real question is whether the offsets are internal or external, because if they're external, certainly from the European side, we're looking very internationally, so if we're not accepting something externally, there's a good reason why not, and therefore if another system did accept those external offsets, that would be a problem. For what's done internally, then indeed part of the proposals in January included a form of domestic project mechanism within the EU. Now, this might be just used for coal mine methane or something like this, but we wouldn't see that would be a concern for others. And if others have offset mechanisms internally, then as long as those are robust, I don't think it would be a problem at all.
Thank you very much. And I'm seeing no more questions. I think we've nicely concluded. It's right on time. And I want to thank you both. Damien, I want to thank you especially for staying up late and for taking the call at home. And Derek for filling in for Jonathan Pershing, who is somewhere over Winnipeg right now and is flying on his way to Japan. Thank you both. And also let people know two things. One is that although the presentations were mailed out, there seems to have been something of a problem, so a few of you have not gotten yours yet, and we are resending them, so you should have them shortly. I also want to remind you this is session number 9 of our webinar series, and there's one more to go. It's scheduled for February 26th, same time as this one, so that is to say 11:30 Pacific time, 1:30 Central Time, 2:30 Eastern. And that one is on emissions trading market fundamentals. I know that we will have Gia Schneider from Credit Suisse with us, and I know there are several others who are invited, but I can't confirm who the second speaker will be. We'll be going over kind of how the emissions trading, the external market works, what the fundamentals are, and who some of the players are in the system. And you're welcome to join us there. We thank you very much for your participating in this session, and look forward to talking to you next time. Thank you.